Hello class, welcome to Social Studies today. Yesterday we started moving on away from the earliest groups of people, which were the Adena, Hopewell, and Mississippian. Remember they go in order, A-H-M. So those were the earliest people, and their civilizations went away. No one is certain why, but they were gone. So the next group of people to live on the land that we now call Indiana in the United States, we had the Miami, which are on the previous page, the Potawatomi, the Lenape. So we learned about all those three tribes yesterday. Today we're adding on the last two, the Shawnee and the Kickapoo. I know it's a fun name. So remember, all of these tribes lived in what is now Indiana at the time when European settlers came and started to settle this land. So these were the groups that were most recently here. And as we learn about them down the road, you will learn that they were very unfairly removed from this land so that other people could live here. We will get to that down the road. But for now, we're really going to focus on their cultures and what it was like to be Native American in Indiana hundreds of years ago. So we talked about the Miami tribe, then the Potawatomi. They were a bit different because they lived on the lake. They lived up by Lake Michigan. So they were able to utilize all those resources that you get with the lake in the building of their homes and the food that they ate. And then we have the Lenape. And one important difference we learned about them, they have different clans, wolf, turtle, and turkey. And we also learned, if you remember it, that the oldest female of each longhouse gets to choose the chief, also known as the sachem. And so that gave women a little bit more power to have their voices heard. So a lot of these other groups, women didn't get to have much say. All right, so today we are going to start off with the Shawnee, and then we will move down into the Kickapoo. And then I've got a few pictures to show you on a slideshow of some longhouses and wigwams and some other things like that. So I will be reading right up in here. If you would like to follow along with me, I believe this is page 37 or 38, 39, somewhere in there, okay? All right, the Shawnee. I've got to get back here by the microphone. Sorry about that. Please follow along. The Shawnee, too, were forced to leave their original homelands in the east by a more powerful Native American group. So this is just like the Lenape. They settled along the Maumee River and also lived in wigwams covered in bark, grasses, and reeds. So we know where they get their reeds, right? They're on a river, and reeds grow along a river. So they were able to use reeds for their homes just like the Potawatomi were. Like the other Native Americans of this period, they farmed and hunted. Every Shawnee person belonged to one of 6 clans. Okay, here's your choices. Turkey, turtle, rounded feet, horse, raccoon, or rabbit. So obviously Mrs. Hare would be in the rabbit clan, right? Children were members of their father's clan. The title of chief passed from father to son. Each village had a large council house, which was used for meetings and celebrations. Their most important celebrations focused on food and farming, so maybe like harvest festivals or spring planting celebrations. All right, so we've got to keep this straight. The Lenape had 3 tribes, wolf, turtle, turkey, okay? The Shawnee had 6, turkey, turtle, rounded feet, horse, raccoon, or rabbit. And the children would take the clan name of their father. And with chiefs, if the father was a chief, then his son would become the next chief. So that's different from the Lenape, right? The Lenape, the oldest woman in the longhouse, got to choose the new chief, right? And in this tribe, it was passed down father to son. So if you were a girl, no chance of being chief. All right, now we're moving on to the Kickapoo. The Kickapoo resisted when stronger Native American groups moved into their lands in the area that is now the states of Ohio, Michigan, and Wisconsin. However, despite their skill in battle, they too were forced to move to new homelands. By the early 1700s, they settled in Indiana. And early 1700s, that was before the United States was a country, so we didn't become an official country until 1776. So they were here way before that. The Kickapoo worked hard to keep their culture from changing. Unlike many other groups, they did not want European traders bringing new things to their villages. So they liked the culture they had, and they didn't want new advancements. They wanted their culture and way of life to stay the same. Like other Native American groups, they lived in wigwams, raised crops, and hunted or fished. In summer, they lived in dome-shaped homes near the fields. In winter, they moved to hunting camps and built oval-shaped wigwams that were easy to move from place to place. And that makes sense. We've talked about if you are following the animals you hunt, you would have to have a house that's easy to move as you go, kind of like a tent, right? The Kickapoo were among the first Native Americans to ride horses when hunting. The Spanish had first brought horses to America in the 1500s, but some horses had run wild. The Kickapoo learned how to catch and ride the wild horses. So sometimes you might see in old cowboy movies and Native American movies that the Native Americans all rode horses. Well, traditionally, there were no horses that lived in our country. So those horses were all brought over from Europe and other parts of the world. So the Native Americans who learned how to tame these wild horses did ride them, but it wasn't that many who did so. So the Kickapoo, that's one thing that sets them apart, makes them different. All right, I'm going to pause just one moment so I can get to our next page. Okay, so I am on to the next page here, and we've covered all 5 groups. So those are our 5 groups, but there are things they all had in common, right? This was a long time ago. Their cultures were different but similar. And so as the time changed, a lot of these groups changed in similar ways. So this first part, we're going to talk about how they adapted to the land. And we know what that word means, right? Changing to fit your surroundings. So if you had to move to a new land, you'd have to adapt how you live on it, right? What you eat, what you wear, how you hunt, how you farm. So we'll cover that first. And then we'll talk about trading. Trading is a pretty big thing, right? Before you could trade, if you didn't have something, you just didn't have it. But once you could trade stuff, you could say, wow, man, that tribe over there, they've got these cool beads. We don't have the material to make those beads, but we've got some really cool pottery. They don't have the same clay we've got. So maybe we can trade. They give us beads, we give them pottery, everyone's got more. So that's kind of how that whole trading, bartering process began. So we're going to get into that second, okay? So we are up here at the top of the page, adapting to the land. Let's see how they had to adapt. Native Americans in Indiana relied on the land to provide for their needs. They adapted to life in the region in many ways. They adapted to situations and adapted objects to meet their needs, maybe like their artifacts. Seasons and the weather caused people to adapt. Native American groups lived in villages, but they moved with the seasons to have a reliable food source. As you read, many Native Americans farmed during the summer and then moved to a place for hunting in the winter. The homes of the different groups were similar. However, depending on the materials available locally, some wigwams were covered in bark, while others were covered in grasses, reeds, or animal skins. So you use what you've got, right? All right, the need for trade. Trade, now this is the definition. Trade is the buying and selling of goods and services. Today, we use money when we trade. So I will trade you $5 for that, meal, okay? Before we had money, I would have to have something of value that the person who had the food wanted. So now that we have money, it makes trading a lot easier. So today we use money when we trade. Money is easy to carry and people agree on its value. We use coins and bills. Other objects have been used for money in the past. So this is kind of cool. Some Native Americans used clam shells as money. So think about that, clam shells. However, not everyone wanted to trade for money. In the past, people traded for things they needed. For instance, someone might have traded dried corn for animal skins that could be made into clothing. So maybe all you do is plant corn, but you still need animal skins to wrap your house in, right? And to cover your body in to keep warm. So you'd have to trade. When Native Americans traded with each other, they often traded for things they could not get nearby. Groups in Indiana traded items with people as far away as the Gulf of Mexico. Now we're at the top of the next page. Some Europeans traded for services, such as being guided on the frontier. Okay, now let's pause a minute, because they just leaped into Europeans without us knowing what that means, okay? So Europeans, actually, we're going to take a quick field trip. All right, you ready? Here we go. Across the room, here we go. Okay, we're going to go look at our map. All right, bear with me here. So This is Europe. All right, this small continent up here, we learned about it earlier this year. And here's the Atlantic Ocean. That is in between Europe and the continent we live on, right? So we live right here at the bottom of Lake Michigan. And this area here was really the area where a lot of the Native Americans we're talking about lived. So when people from Europe over here went across the ocean and found this new area, to them, it was a brand new piece of land. They'd never heard of it. They had never seen it. No one knew it was there, except obviously the people who already lived there, right? So the Native Americans are like, obviously it's here. We've been living here for hundreds of years. But people in Europe didn't know that. Okay, no one had crossed the Atlantic Ocean yet to see that there was more land over there. So long story short, all these people from Europe, okay, and we call them colonizers or settlers, but most of them had white skin. Most of the people in Europe, that's the culture there. So they would have maybe looked kind of like me. I'm English, if that's the best I can guess. One side of my family can trace back to England. So all these people from Europe started coming over to this new land they'd found, thinking, man, look at all this wonderful land that we can just take and use. However, was it theirs for the taking? That's the question. Didn't someone already live there? Yeah. We've just spent the last several days talking about these amazing cultures, civilizations, tribes that have been living here off the land for a long time. So when all these new people just showed up and started bossing all these people around, you can imagine that they kind of started to butt heads, right? They didn't agree. So some tribes liked these new settlers more than others. So when we read about this and about trading, hopefully this will make more sense now. But we will kind of rewind after this chapter and start talking more about the Europeans and what it meant as they came over to what is now the United States. Okay, so now let's read this up here with a little bit more background knowledge. Some Europeans traded for services, such as being guided. Sorry, I've got to plug my microphone back in. Some Europeans traded for services, such as being guided on the frontier. Most of them traded for goods, especially furs. Native Americans did not have metal pots or utensils for cooking. Okay, so they didn't have metal in the New World yet. They made and used pots from clay and knives from stone. Therefore, European metal products were popular trade goods. Europeans also traded wool blankets for glass items and glass items for furs. Both groups were able to trade to get what they needed or wanted. By using European goods, the cultures of Native Americans slowly began to change. So we're almost finished, but let's think about that for 1 minute. All right, let's say before in your tribe, your job was to make all the clay pots. So you would go every day or however often and gather clay from a riverbank. You would mold it around, make the shape you wanted, make it smooth, make a nice container maybe to store your grain or your corn. You make a lid for it. That would take a lot of time, right? If that was your job. Okay, well now the Europeans have arrived. Whether we like it or not, they're here. And they've got all these new things I've never even heard of, like metal. Could you imagine seeing metal for the first time, wondering what in the world that was? So they're willing to trade me a few deer skins for a metal pot. Do you think I'd like that pot? You know, it kind of depended. Some people thought, well, that's going to make my life so much easier. I don't have to go make new clay pots all the time. I can just have this metal one that will last me forever. Other people were thinking, I like my job of making clay pots. This is what we've always done. Why would I do away with all the things that make us special and our culture what it is? So some Native Americans wanted new things. Other Native Americans said, nah, I'm good. I don't need new things. We're good the way we've been doing things. So that's kind of the beginning of the Europeans coming. We'll get more into that next week. So before we move too far into Europeans, I want to show you some pictures of some things that have to do with Native American way of life. So I will pause. When I'm back, we will have a short slideshow to discuss. All right. So first thing to look at, this is a wigwam. We've seen one other picture in the book. And if you have ever been to the Feast of the Hunter's Moon, typically in 4th grade, we always go in the fall, so it was a total bummer this year we didn't get to go. But there's usually a wigwam there. So maybe if you've been before, you may have gotten to sit inside a wigwam like this. If not, You can always go sometime in the future when that big feast starts happening again. But the first picture shows you, these are the saplings. So when they're talking about young trees, small trees, you want young trees that are still flexible, bendable, right? We don't want them to be too rigid, to use one of our vocab words. So you build this frame and you tie them together with bits of bark or whatever type of cord you could find, maybe some vines. And once you have your structure built, then you can lay over it different materials. So this would be whatever you had. So if you lived in the forest, you'd probably use a lot of tree bark, things like that. If you had lots of people that hunted in your tribe and you had a lot of furs, you could cover them with furs. Remember the people that lived near the water. They wouldn't have had as many large trees, but they would have had lots of reeds growing along the water, cattails and things. And when you pick those and they dry out, you can weave them together to make like a mat. Or so you could cover your whole house in a woven reed material. So other things they might use, grass. If you lived out in a prairie area, you have a lot of tall grasses. You can weave those together. We've got brush, bark, rushes, which are kind of like reeds, mats, hides, and cloth. So really anything to keep you protected from the elements was your roof and your walls. All right? So there's our wigwam. I'm going to go switch to the next slide, which is a longhouse. All right, longhouses. So we do know longhouses were more permanent structures, right? It would take a lot more time to take that down. So they probably were not the things being moved during hunting seasons, right? This is what you'd have set up when you were permanently settled for a while. Sometimes they could be up to 300 feet long. That is a long building. These buildings kept families warm and safe. So if you remember in our reading, sometimes up to 7 families would live in one longhouse. So if you look down through here, you might have several different fire pits, and they would cut small holes in the roof to let the smoke out. You would maybe have different sleeping areas around. You'd probably have storage areas for food and different important tools you had to use. And if you think about it, keeping a bunch of people together in one space, does that help conserve your heat, help keep the heat all together? Yes. So longhouse, even though it's a huge building, you could fit a bunch of people in and keep everyone warm and together. All right, let me pause. Okay. This next slide is about a special place called Kionga, or Kikayonga. I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing it correctly, but it's close. So if this is the map of Indiana, which it is, okay, we live right here. Here's Lafayette. So here's our Wabash River. It goes right through town, and it keeps going north up here towards Fort Wayne, okay? So we've talked a bit about Fort Wayne. I grew up just north of that. So this area was a very special area. And if you're having trouble seeing, make sure you zoom in so you can see the picture. But in this area where Fort Wayne is, there are lots of rivers that all join together. So if you think about river travel, which is what a lot of people did back in this time, because Indiana was full of dense forests and trees, and it's hard to walk through if you don't have a path, right? If you've ever walked through the woods where there's no path cut, it's really hard to travel. So they would use the rivers a lot to get places more quickly. So Kikayonga was the capital of the Miami tribe. So the Miami is the group we learned about first yesterday. And that is where the St. Joseph, St. Mary's, and Maumee rivers all came together right here at present-day Fort Wayne. And in 1794, they founded that same spot as the city of Fort Wayne. But long before Fort Wayne existed, Native Americans had used it as an important spot. And here's why. It was important because of its distance to the Wabash River. So here's Fort Wayne, where all these rivers come together, and here's the Wabash. So we're going to learn about something called a portage. So it was part of the portage between the Maumee and Wabash rivers. We haven't really looked at that yet, but a portage is when you'd have to carry your canoe or your kayak. Like if you want to switch from one river to one way over there that aren't connected, you would have a buddy, take one end, you carry the other end, and you actually carry your canoe all the way across the land until you get to the other water. So a lot of backpackers do this. I've actually never done a backpacking trip with a canoe or kayak, but I know people who have. So let's say there is a river that stops over here, but there's another river a mile away that I want to hop into. I've got to get out, carry my kayak or canoe a mile, and drop it in the water. So their portage, that's what you call that, a portage. They would take their canoes out of the water up here, and then they would walk across the land and drop them back in to the Wabash River. And then they could travel all the way down to here without hacking through the woods. So it was a very important place, and that is why we think it was their capital city. And I'll be right back. Okay, so here's a little bit more about portages. And now, obviously, these aren't Native Americans, but people still do this now. So a portage is a path for carrying boats over land to avoid river obstacles or between two bodies of water. So it's not always fun and easy. Sometimes when you walk through the woods on any path, there's trees that are down, you have to climb over. That's hard enough when you're just walking. But if you're carrying a canoe or a kayak, that can be very tricky. So sometimes you have a really nice clear path. Sometimes in a river like this, look at all those boulders. They can't get through there. So they're going to have to carry their kayak or canoe over that section and then drop it in when it's safe to travel. So think, why did the Native Americans have to do this? We kind of covered that on the last slide. If they didn't move their canoes to the Wabash River, were they going to be able to travel as far and get as many resources they needed? Nope. All right, one more slide. All right. So this is our last slide today. I want to review some of the important vocab words and concepts we've talked about. This is not everything. We will continue to learn about Native Americans on Tuesday. Just a reminder, on Monday we don't have any school, not in person, not virtual, nothing. So take 3-day weekend off to relax. Okay, so this is our last slide. Before I go over the vocab, let's take a look at the pictures. So up in both of these top pictures, we have examples of artifacts. Now remember, an artifact is an object made by people, right? The material they don't have to make, but if they took a stick and whittled it into something else, that's an artifact, right? Same with rocks or anything else. All right, now the bottom pictures down here, we've got woolly mammoths or mastodons. It's hard to tell which is which. Here's a mastodon. And this is just an interesting size comparison. So they were much larger than elephants. But unfortunately, they are extinct. Okay? Extinct means to die out. There are no more left. So just like the dinosaurs are extinct, there are none left. The same thing happened to a lot of the large animals during the Ice Age, which we've read quite a bit about lately. So for various reasons, they could not adapt and they couldn't survive. So the woolly mammoth, the mastodon, the saber-toothed tiger, the giant sloth, there's a lot, dire wolves, all those big mammals all died out. So they are extinct. All right, now let's hit all the other words we've missed. Nomads. Remember, nomads are people that keep moving around. So the people that crossed over the land bridge to start moving all around our country and spreading out, they were nomads, right? They followed their food, and they didn't have a permanent place they lived. We talked about extinct. Okay, permanent. Permanent means long-lasting. So the best way to remember this is a permanent marker. Okay, permanent marker, hard to get rid of. You can get rid of it, but you have to work at it, right? Okay, so permanent is not supposed to just wear off. An artifact, we talked about that, something that people have made in the past. A tribe is a group, okay? We know that. So there's lots of different Native American tribes. Most all of those tribes would have a leader. So kind of like the American culture, we have elected leaders. Tribes also had leaders. And a clan. A clan is a group of closely related people. So remember, in some of our different tribes, I don't want to mess this up, the Lenape, they had turkey, turtle. I don't remember the other one for sure. I don't want to say the wrong thing. But then when we learned about the Potawatomi, they had all, I think, 6 different ones, right? Rounded feet, raccoon, and rabbit, all these different kinds. So clans are groups of closely related people. So it could maybe even be like, your aunts, uncles, cousins. You'd all be a clan, okay, within a tribe. All right. We will have one more day to go over Native American things next week on Tuesday. And then we are going to start learning more about the explorers, the people from Europe who came. And we're going to learn about what they did to the tribes. Some of the story is not pretty, but it is part of our past and our history, so we should know what happened. All right. Thanks for joining me today. I'll see you soon.